Okay, good afternoon, historians. We're going to take a look at a presentation that will try to answer the questions: how did technology change the nature of war, including its impact on civilians on a global scale? Okay, so the first topic we're going to look at is weapons of war. Here we go. So, if you take a look at this slide, you'll see a dreadnought battleship. This is a type of battleship that has some advanced armor and more evenly distributed guns, I guess. So the cannons, the artillery that is on this ship is a more advanced design, is born in the 20th century, and during the First World War is the first time we're going to see navies with dreadnought designs come up against each other. One thing that really kept the war going was shipping from overseas, and it was important to be able to stop that, especially for the German side, to keep their war effort up. So submarine warfare was implemented widely for the first time, mostly by the Germans during the First World War. Because of the bog down in the trenches on the Western Front, it was necessary to invent weapons that would help the sides break through and out of the trenches and get the war mobile again in order for a victory to be achieved. And one of the inventions that was created was poisonous gas. Chlorine gas and mustard gas were first implemented during World War I. And you can see in this picture a mule and also a man that has an accommodation to protect them from chemical warfare. Machine guns are actually a 19th century invention, but were mass-produced and used widely during the First World War. They had a devastating effect on troops trying to jump out of the trenches and to attack troops in trenches on the other side. So you could mow down a whole bunch of people very quickly with a machine gun. Terrible invention. In order to get out of those trenches and across no man's land, eventually artillery was armored and mobilized in the form of a tank. So this invention could help get soldiers across the trenches and past the enemy's lines, and did have a huge impact on the war, but did not solve every problem. This is the first war that was fought also in the air, at least offensively. Balloons had been used in the past and dirigibles to gather intelligence, and airplanes in this case too. But for the first time, planes were weaponized in the forms of bombs and guns. So you can see here there's a picture of a pilot who's actually literally dropping a bomb by hand over the enemy lines. This, by the end of the war, is the kind of bomber that was being produced. It has the ability to carry 2,000 kilograms of bombs. It's 4 times as many as a previous bomber. And in order to keep these things at bay, there was quick advancements in fighter planes. So these planes, at the start of World War I, basically the pilots had handheld guns, and they might have an extra person trying to shoot from the plane. But by the end, they had machine guns that were mounted between the pilot and the propeller, and were actually timed to fire bullets when the propeller was not in the way. They actually had a few cases where people blew their propellers off. So please take a moment here and respond to this question. What kinds of new technology were used during World War I? Okay, so in order to have all these weapons, it requires total warfare, or mobilization on every front. And we're going to examine that from an American perspective, but please keep in mind this was typical of all the combatants in the First World War. If you take a look at this slide, you can see a lot of bombs on the factory floor, and you can see women inspecting these weapons. Women had a very important role to play in the First World War, which was a total war, because they took on roles in the industry that men had previously served but were now unavailable because they were needed to fight in the military, which was still mainly men's work. You can see here that governments launched aggressive campaigns to get soldiers to sign up for these wars because there was plenty of different aspects in the military where manpower was needed. The practical impact of the industry mass producing these new advanced weapons were that lots and lots of soldiers died. If you take a look at the relative impact from previous wars, you could understand why a lot of people who were influenced by this propaganda really had no idea what kind of conflict they were signing up for. And the military deaths here in the millions, you can see for World War I, it's almost 9 million, about 8.4 or 8.5 million people under arms died. This does not include civilian deaths associated from being caught in the middle or from starvation. So it was a really terrible war. You can see there's some men in the trenches here. And this is an example of some American propaganda. America's not going to get into the war until a little bit later, a little bit after the start, really quite close to the end. But you can see Woodrow Wilson down here. He was already involved in providing weapons to France and England before the United States got involved with the war. So what I would like you to do is pause here just a minute and answer, why did the United States have a head start on the ability to make supplies and armaments needed for World War I? The United States had its own expeditionary force that joined the Western Front. It was led by John Pierson, who was already an American war hero. You may recall from our lesson about American imperialism that he was one of the commanding officers over in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and the Filipino-American War as well. The need for troops increased the demand and acceptance of African Americans in the military. You can see here, this poster says, "True Sons of Freedom, the colored man is no slacker." They were recruited aggressively, and they served in segregated units, at least under the American command in the First World War. There were some African American volunteers who went to fight on behalf of France and England, and they served in integrated units. The War Industries Board is a bureaucratic measure by the government to organize private industry for wartime production. We're going to stop making cars and start making tanks, that kind of thing. We're no longer making commercial aircraft, and we're going to make military aircraft. People at home had a role to play as well. You can see in this poster, people were encouraged to grow their own food at home, and this would lessen the demand on American agriculture and provide more food availability to our troops and also for our allies overseas. Saving energy is a focus of these two posters. Coal was used to make electricity and drive industry, and gasoline to power vehicles, right? So if we have more of these resources available, it'll help us win the war more quickly. Why was public opinion so important in the total war effort? Take a moment here to answer that question. If you take a look at this picture, it shows troops being trained. We didn't have a large standing military. About 200,000 at the outset of the First World War, about the same as England at the start. So we needed time to gear our troops up. So we start fighting in 1918 in the First World War. And you can see by some of these photos and artist renditions that the Allied forces did participate on the Western Front. And they made a critical difference at a time when the German side and the Austrian-Hungarian side was already beginning to collapse, but not quite ready for defeat. So as a result of American participation, as a result of American production through the course of the war. Generally, Germany agrees to an armistice, which will turn into a surrender. And the armistice was signed on November the 11th, 1918, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And we still remember Armistice Day today as Veterans Day. Take a look at this graph and remember the previous graph where we talked about total casualties under arms. That was about 8.4 million. Based on this graph, which countries do you think are suffering the worst from the First World War? The United States really benefited a lot from World War I. If you take a look at the information on the slide, you can see some of the benefits that it enjoyed. Question: how do you think imperialized people from around the world will be impacted by World War I? So we're going to take a little bit deeper dive on impacts in society. First, we're going to look at the impact on women's society. If you take a look at this slide, you can see women working on this broad piece of material. They have tools in their hands, and this is actually a wingspan, so they're building an aircraft. This is another kind of representation of roles that they had in industry. Women played a direct role supporting combat. If you look at the poster on the right, it has an image that shapes a woman taking her role as a mother and becoming a healer to combatants in the First World War. Greatest mother in the world. So women had a big role in nursing. That sort of really began during the American Civil War, but also was a major impact on the First World War. And you can see in this poster on the left, younger women are being targeted, the Young Women's Christian Association, for their work and contribution to making the victory in the First World War possible. And the economic benefits and the recognition that women received because of their contribution to the First World War led them to push and finally achieve suffrage, universal suffrage in the United States. So, what ways would you say the war changed women's role in society? If your answers look like what's on the slide above, then you are on the right track. Now let's take a look at the role of African Americans in the First World War. This poster declares African American men as the true sons of freedom. It's got Abraham Lincoln up on the right, liberty and freedom shall not perish from the earth. That's one of the promises he made during the American Civil War. And you can see that the Germans are surrendering under the bayonets of African American soldiers. An impact on African American populations in the United States demographically was a second Great Migration. So the first one was at the time of emancipation. A lot of African Americans left the South and moved north, and there was another great pull of African American populations to cities, industrial cities that were supporting the war effort. So you can see how the population demographics of certain cities changed very quickly as a result of the First World War. With the manpower mobilization of World War I and immigration from Europe cut off, industrial cities of the Northwest and Midwest experienced severe labor shortages. Northern manufacturers recruited throughout the South, and an exodus of workers ensued. By 1919, an estimated 500,000 African Americans had migrated from the southern United States to industrial cities in the Northeast and Midwest in the first wave of the Great Migration. which continued until 1940. African American workers filled new positions in expanding industries such as railroads, as well as many jobs formerly held by whites. In some cities, they were hired as strikebreakers, especially during the strikes of 1917. NAACP Field Secretary, civil rights activist, and author James Weldon Johnson coined the term Red Summer for the period starting late winter, spring, and summer in the early autumn of 1919, because it was marked by hundreds of deaths and a large number of casualties across the United States, which resulted from anti-black white supremacist terrorist attacks that occurred in more than a dozen cities and one rural country. In most instances, whites attacked African Americans. In your words, describe how did the lives of African Americans change and stay the same during and after World War I? If your answers were like the answers on the slide above, you are on the right track. Another thing we need to take a look at in terms of impacts on societies is about civil liberties. Civil liberties are defined as the state of being subject only to laws established for the good of the community, especially with regard to freedom of action and speech. And it doesn't even need to be said that that was different depending on who you were in America. But as a consequence of World War I, American attitudes and also the government's tolerance of speech changed. So you can see from this poster a picture of a spider in a web with the Kaiser's face. And it's encouraging people not to speak casually about things of strategic importance because you never know who is listening. And people were especially suspicious of German Americans during this time. The Supreme Court approved some restrictions on government free speech during First World War. Here's a quote: "The protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." And there's a lot of times that people will use that as a very basic and simple explanation of how your freedom of speech is not always 100% guaranteed. But in this instance, they're talking about things that are a problem for the war effort. This slide shows anti-German sentiment and discusses a little bit about what it was like to be treated differently because of your German heritage in the United States during the First World War. So what I would like you to do is pause this here for just a second and answer the question, how were American values impacted by the First World War? If your answers are like the answers on the slide above, then you're on the right track. Next thing we need to take a look at is the American economy. Take a look at the average annual income between 1914 and 1920. The average goes from $627 to $1,407 a year. So by the end of the 1920s, and over the course of just 6 years, American income on average doubles. So people were feeling relatively rich to what they had experienced more towards the beginning of that decade. This graph shows GDP, that's gross domestic product. It's an indicator of economic health because it's the value of all goods and services made in the United States. And you can see between 1914 and 1919, a huge impact on the production in the United States. Lots of money is being made. Wealth is flowing into the country. America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not storms, but normalcy. So after World War I ends, a more conservative government is ushered in. And one of the consequences of that is going to be that the United States, in its proposals to avoid war ever happening again, conceives of the creation of a League of Nations. This is meant to stop the alliance systems and secret alliances to cause unexpected global conflicts ever again. And even though the United States is the home of the League of Nations in New York City, and it is the idea of the American president, Woodrow Wilson, the United States Senate does not vote to join the League of Nations, ironically. So, the First World War supercharged the American economy. Our closing question for this presentation, what do you think would be the impact on the economies of Europe at the conclusion of this war?